Hey, John. I think we can start. Unfortunately, we have many fewer people than we expected, but we will be making a recording and we'll be publishing it, and maybe it will be very useful for the people who did turn up.
Yeah, I'm
Because
just asking. I'm wondering if maybe it makes sense to consolidate groups a little bit. If you only have, if there's like 4 people per room, maybe it makes sense to put some of the rooms together. So I'm just asking Matt. Just give me a couple of minutes.
there are more people in other workshops, like
I
10.
see. So it's only
Yeah.
this one that's unpopular. I got it. Okay.
Yeah, we allocated them based on preferences, but for some reason, for this specific one, people didn't turn up. There should have been like 15 of them, but yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Then I can get started. I guess given we only have 4 people, maybe it makes sense to just begin by asking a little bit about the background or standard of people in the room, just so I have some context here. I mean, are you all people who've done a lot of debating? Is this like your first point of contact? I have not been very involved with this sort of program so far, so I don't have much background for the level that everyone's at. I can see one person's face, but no one is unmuted.
Yeah, as for me, I think I'm debating for about 3 or 4 years for now, but still trying to expand my knowledge.
Okay, sure. So we've got one person.
Did I get the topic of that workshop right? That it is mostly for whip speeches, or it is about analysis in every speech?
Well, I think of analysis as being something that's like primarily an important bit of substantive speeches. So if anything, a whip speech would be the kind of speech I think it least pertains to. Although there's obviously some elements to which, like, having a good capacity to, explain things well is very valuable in different bits of debating. So okay, but one person who's done it for 3 years, one person for 2 years, and then 2. I'm not sure if you're there. I hope you're there. It would be good to know that everyone who's in the room is in the room. So I guess just say hi in the chat or something. But okay, let me work out how to share some slides here.
Sorry. Can I answer answer questions? My experience in debate is only less than 1 year, and I'm a newbie, and I will be glad to listen to your lecture. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Does anyone know how I can share my screen on this platform? I'm trying to work out how to share the slides I was given for this, but I'm not quite familiar with this platform. There's going to be a button somewhere. Cast this meeting. There's a press present now button on your bottom right. Okay. A tab. Let's do this one. All right. So let me know that you can see you're presenting your screen. I don't know if you can see these slides. Okay. Cool. Okay. So what am I going to talk about? I guess I'm talking primarily about how you should think about like sort of constructing the sort of body of most arguments. So in debating, there's a lot of different elements that go into being a good speaker. Some of it is presentation, some of it is strategy. You both have to be able to be persuasive in the way that you say things. You also have to pick useful things to say. But a very fundamental bit of the activity, and indeed one of the most basic elements, is just the ability to construct arguments well. And what I mean by that is, if you go and watch a lot of, weaker debates, you'll still see people who just sort of state things, like it often comes down to a process of, one team says this, the other team says that, and no one really elaborates or substantiates what they want to talk about. There's merely just like a sort of flinging of various things against the wall, and then some of it sticks and some of it doesn't. So I want to talk a little bit about today is the process of how you make arguments well, how you make them persuasive, and how you make them robust to the sorts of things that other people are likely to say. So yeah, I guess these slides I've been given have some reasonable breakdown of things that we want to do. So let's just work through things one at a time. And by the way, I'm very happy if people want to ask questions or talk about specific things as we go on. It's a bit, I think it's difficult to sort of speak in the abstract about an activity for, I guess this is for 2 hours. So it would be helpful if I had some, you know, anyone has thoughts or observations they want to make, would be a useful thing to have. So, okay, what do people mean by analysis? I guess the definition here is pretty reasonable. It's sort of the underlying logical structure of why the things that you're trying to say are true. Now, I guess we can, one thing, actually, let me stay this away if I can. Just add random slides to this. One of these buttons has to be add a new slide. Or whatever. Okay. I'm just going to bin some of these things. So let me begin. Can I not even edit this? Wow. Okay. All right. What I was going to say is, when I used to debate a lot, I basically had a given format for every argument that I ever wanted to make. And the reason I had a given format is that I was a big believer that various elements of debating could be made very formulaic, or at least there are certain things that you wanted to do such an overwhelming percentage of the time that you shouldn't really leave it to chance or believe that you're just going to do these things automatically. You should try and give yourself a structure that makes these things possible. And in particular, what were the things that I was doing? I'd really like to be able to write some stuff down. So let me put in the notes. Okay, so the first thing that I used, you know what, let me stop sharing this and then go to my drive. Make a new Google slide. Got it. So slide. Okay. Now I click this button. Okay. Now I should be sharing. Okay. Now I am sharing my whole screen. Now I hope that I have nothing terrible up. I guess it's fine. Okay. So what were the things that I would put down basically for every argument? So the first thing was some kind of like simple statement of what I wanted to talk about, or like, and sometimes you can think of it as like a hook. The second thing was sort of like, then just a laundry list of like reason one, and then sort of like why, reason two, why, and then, and basically, you know, every argument that I just like have a piece of paper, I'd like leave a little block to do the first thing, the sort of statement of what I wanted to talk about. Then I'd have just like point A, point B, point C, and then some like detail underneath each of those things. And the reason why, even though there's a cookie structure for every argument that you make, I keep being told that you miss links. Well, yeah, I guess this is what I mean. Like, if you think about it, every argument sort of like has the same Platonic form, right? Like there is something that you believe is true that probably is non-trivial. And in order for someone to believe that, you need to elaborate on certain elements that might not be obvious to people and then explain why those things are valuable. So like to pick a simple, like a very classic schools debate, something like legalizing all drugs, right? You know, you might have, like to pick an example of this slide, say like legalize all drugs. What is like a normal argument someone might want to make in this debate? Anyone want to offer an argument that you might make? Yeah, sure. Okay. Better safety. Right. Why is that true? Like, what are the things that are contentious about that claim, and why are those things either not relevant or not true? Is the kind of questions that I'd ask myself. Well, you know, I think the elements of this that you need to talk about are things like, well, like in what context are people using drugs? Why are drugs sometimes unsafe? What changes about the way situations people use drugs? And I think those are all very natural questions that you could ask yourself, and they very obviously pertain to the thing you're trying to prove. Like if you want to prove that legalizing all drugs would increase the safety for users, then you would need to sort of elaborate to a judge, like, well, why and how are people using them? What elements of that are unsafe? What's going to change if we implement this policy? And then maybe some exogenous effects. And then sort of falling within this structure, probably the way this argument would end up being done by me, if this was something that I was doing, well, I'd have some like introductory thing, like one of the most important things in this debate is like safety, because like dying is obviously a very bad thing, like long-term health issues are bad, and so on and so on. And then I just step them through one at a time. Like I just break down the set of things that I think are contentious into different little bullet points, and I try and talk through them in some detail. And then as long as you're like elaborating on all of the elements of an argument to a reasonable degree, I think it's unlikely that people are going to say that you miss links. As in, what a judge typically means when you miss a link is that, you know, you ended up at some conclusion without really thinking through some of the obvious things that a person was going to find unobvious, right? So for example, if you said that legalizing drugs was going to lead to better safety, and all you spoke about was like making the situations in which people use drugs better, I think a judge would be very entitled to go, well, like, it seems like the most dangerous bit of using drugs is like the fact that you're shooting up heroin. It's not like that you shot up heroin in a slightly safer place. Like there's obviously like a huge incremental step in the like level of danger that comes between like not using drugs at all and using drugs to some degree. And maybe there's some like more flexibility within the like situations in which you use it. You do need to address the concern that maybe like facilitating more access to that behavior is a bad thing, right? And so that's the kind of link that you can miss. And I think the way that you address that is sort of asking those very basic questions that I wanted to talk about, right? So, you know, when you're sitting down and thinking of an argument, you ask lots of simple questions, and then they should inform you about what your reasons need to be. Like, what are the elements of this argument that you would need to lay out for a reasonable person to believe that this is true? And then the last thing that sort of falls within this natural structure that I want to talk about is just explaining why that it's important. And I think that obviously people, I think, typically think about analysis in the context of, well, you're trying to demonstrate whether something is true or not, but the same skill set and indeed the same like logical structure roughly applies to trying making your arguments important, right? Like as much as people often rely on very basic things to explain why an argument is important, they might say something like, well, you know, this argument, if true, would mean that 10 people die, but our argument, if true, would mean that like 100 people die and 100 is bigger than 10. That's fine, but ultimately, the tasks of convincing a judge that something is true and convincing a judge that something is important are both very conceptually similar things. Like you're trying to take someone from a point that is not obvious to some kind of like useful end state that makes them believe your side of it more. And so the same questions, kind of process of asking myself questions and then trying to answer them would apply, right? Like if I was trying to convince someone in a debate about, I don't know, what do people debate about? Like maybe a foreign policy debate, right? That like objective X is more important than objective Y. Like maybe you're trying to trade off between like stabilizing a region and getting rid of some like bad leader or something. Well, again, you need to think about, well, what are the elements that someone's going to be concerned with in this debate? And then how do I, you know, articulate whatever relevant reasons there are such that the things that I want to talk about make sense? And then, you know, it should be obvious as a conclusion of asking the right questions that your stuff is more important than another person. So again, this is all very abstract. Let's go through. Yeah, I mean, this slide has basically the same stuff, maybe in a much more curtailed version. You know, why is something true and why does it matter? Yeah, so let's begin to dig in a little bit about how you might do some of this stuff. So in the stuff that I wrote out quickly, you know, I just sort of put down like reason 1, reason 2, reason 3. How would you actually try and articulate some of this stuff? Well, I think there are basically two elements to this. The first element is basically just giving as much description as possible, right? So one very common way that arguments can be flawed or be ineffectual is that you say something, and maybe it's even like a reasonably explained claim that is sort of true, but it's difficult to see that it applies to enough cases or that it is actually relevant to the debate at hand. And so let me try and think of another motion where this might be true. Yeah, to pick like another classic schooly debate, let's think about the topic where you would allow parents to have children with them in jail if the child would like otherwise go to foster care or something, you know, like allowing people who are prisoners to raise their like young children in jail with them. So a common argument that might be made is that, well, like a natural argument, I think, for the proposition of that debate to make is to say that it's very damaging to a child to not be raised around their parent, or that it's just better for them to be with their parent than to be in a situation outside of that. And I've seen versions of this debate in schools where people talk a lot in quite good detail and length about, you know, the nature of the parent-child relationship and what like a parent offers you in comparison to being bounced around between different kinds of foster care, right? But in some sense, that is like missing a very important element of the discussion here, which is like prison is not a nice place to be raising a child, right? There are obviously some defects to that environment compared to some of the alternatives that are available. So in terms of like making that claim substantively and well, you need to not just talk about what are the positive elements of the claim that I want to make, like what are the things that are like proactively getting me to the point I want to be. You also need to think about, well, what are the like sort of caveats that I need to give, or the little potential problems that I need to address in passing. And as a result, probably that argument to be made well, it can't just be that, and it can't just be an exposition about why parents are a very good thing to have around. It has to encompass something a bit broader. It has to be like, what are the two versions of the life this child is going to lead? What are the elements of those lives? And how do we weigh those two different things? And so you can have some kind of elaboration of like, what is it like to be in jail? What are the downsides? How can those be mitigated? Why might those not be relevant? What's the alternative, living in foster care? What are the pros and cons of that? And so the more you can think about the question of, well, in what situations is my argument actually going to apply? And what are the things that a reasonable person is going to ask themselves when they hear me say this kind of stuff? I think the more likely it is that you'll end up hitting the, you know, natural bits of stuff that you need to hit in an argument. And I think this is a good point to say that if you watch like, I want to say if you watch a lot of better debates recently, I don't really watch a lot of like videos of it. I never really did, but some of the debates that I've been in when I've like sort of dipped my toes back into the pool and done a few speeches in a couple of tournaments, and some of the more recent stuff I've seen, there has been a tendency for people to, there's a lot of things you can see that are very like sneaky or clever. Like, especially there are a lot of people these days who make arguments that are like very strategically nuanced. They make a lot of unobvious claims and manage to get through. And so I think some people often have this notion that in order to be good at debating, you have to be like really, really clever and come up with all of this obvious stuff. Like at the end of the day, I think it's important to keep in mind that for the purposes of debating, like you are trying to convince someone of something in a very limited time frame. And it's also important to remember that a judge is extremely unlikely to remember most of the things you say. Like, I'll be honest, most people who judged me, I think would struggle to like reasonably like articulate every argument that was said and all of the details if they didn't have their notes. And like, I would say 80% of the judges wouldn't be able to do that even with their notes. And like, certainly when I judged, it was not true that like I was deeply weighing every single claim that was made, because I think it's just impossible to really like give, you know, obviously judges aspire to do this and think about everything that is said, but there's like a limited time in the adjudication. There's a limited capacity you have to like process everything properly. And so I want to stress that like you can get like 90% of the way in debating by just asking yourselves those basic questions like, what would a reasonable person be concerned at with the argument that I want to make? what are the situations that this apply in, and how can I like lay down some things that make it obvious that this is probably true, or at least more likely that it is true, and then you probably won't mess up too badly. Like, even if you don't win every BP round that you're ever in, it's very difficult to come fourth if you're doing these things on a regular basis. Are there any questions so far? Nope, okay. Let's go into why this is important. So yeah, I guess the basic question here fundamentally is like, why does this matter? And I think this is another, so essentially we're trying to preempt opposition. Yeah, to talk a little bit about that statement. Yeah, in the context of trying to, you know, make your arguments good, I think that it's very difficult to be good as a substantive speaker if you're not thinking at all about what people are going to say in response to stuff, right? Like, every good argument sort of implicitly has some offense and some defense, right? Like, you have some offensive stuff insofar as like you're good at elaborating on why the things you want to claim are true, right? Like, if you want to prove that, like, I don't know, you want to prove that we should like invade some country, and you want to prove that it will be successful, like, you can be really good at explaining that, like, we'll be able to like target this particular thing. We have these allies, these resources in the region, blah, blah, blah. But if you don't think at all about what like the opposition is going to do, like what the potential difficulties or problems that you might face are, then even if you're substantively very good, there's going to be obvious ways for an opponent to like try and step around you or like nitpick at various problems. So good arguments in asking questions about, well, how am I going to convince a reasonable person that this stuff is true? They sort of naturally need to ask the question, well, what is someone going to say in order to try and combat me? Or what are the things that are going to be concerning to a reasonable person when they're sort of presented with this argument? So yeah, I mean, another thing to say, like, I'll sort of give the second bit of this new slide. So like every first, like I spoke Prime Minister for basically the entire time I was doing BP debating. So on my first page, and again, I formed like a very formulaic structure, everything. So I had like an introduction. This is what my first page looked like, right? Then I had some sort of like clarify, model, preempt section. And then I had, you know, point 1, point 2. And so basically this would be like argument 1, argument 2. And this is sort of like, what is our model? What's important? What does, like, I mean, you know, I sort of forced myself to ask the question of like, well, you know, what are we doing? Like, you obviously have some introduction, like whatever way you want to like sort of grab the attention of the judge. And then you go through like just a very formulaic set of things, right? Sort of, what's the model? Like, what are we actually defending? What in this round is important? Like, who are the relevant stakeholders? And then, you know, I often like to start just by being very clear that, you know, like the opposition needs to prove X thing or Y thing, or they can't run away from like this thing or the other thing. Like, sort of, it makes it more natural, I think, for your arguments to flow and have a lot of like substantive force behind them if you've sort of like laid the ground very well. Like, you have a very clear notion of like what you're trying to prove and why it matters. And then the things you want to say later should very naturally flow on from that. But okay, let's go back here. So explaining why arguments are important and substantive. So yeah, I guess this slide says the very basic question is like, why does this matter? And the reason for this, you know, I think there's a very good reason why BP debating turns on this question a lot more than 3-on-3 debating. And it's that you have much more limited time per team. So in 3-on-3 debating, there's sort of like only 2 possible outcomes, right? Like the affirmative wins or the negative side wins. And you have a very long span of time in which to sort of expound on, you know, what the relevant details of your arguments are. And probably over the course of the full 24 minutes of speaking that you have, notwithstanding reply speeches even, like it should become clear what things matter and why, and also the fine amount of details become very clear. Like there's nowhere to really hide in a 3-on-3 debate. And so I think the standard of argumentation as a whole is much better, and strategically it's much more straightforward insofar as, you know, you don't really have to be that clever strategically, right? Maybe there's some subtleties in terms of like how you decide to like lay things out and approach the debate as a whole, but you really just have to bulldoze your way through one of the team. In BP, you have this problem where there's like a million things flying around. There's 4 teams. Like these days, you're not even safe from your own closing. Like I did like one tournament recently, like in every second round, my closing team was rebutting me, which was just unthinkable when I was doing the activity at university. So, you know, there's a lot of mess. And so a very relevant thing is how you can make an argument sound important. And how do you do that? Well, you know, there's a couple of things that you might want to talk about. So you can talk about numerical. So you can talk about like how argument pertains to a larger number of people. You can talk about things like the degree to which a thing matters. So, you know, if a policy is going to like displace like 100,000 people or mildly inconvenience, you know, 100,000 people, well, it's obviously relevant to think about the extent to which the like positive or negative thing is happening. So on top of just like your thing affects more people, you can talk about degree. There's sort of like principles which sort of broadly fall within that kind of stuff. You can think about, you know, are there like moral intuitions that people have that should naturally lead you to conclude that certain arguments matter more than other things? But still fundamentally, I think you can ask yourself the same kind of questions that I was talking about before, right? Like in the process of making something important, you're still fundamentally trying to convince a judge, like some hopefully reasonable person. So if you start talking about some like extremely arcane, you know, weird thing that maybe is very like intellectually robust, I think judges are like well within their rights and frequently go like, don't care, didn't understand. So, you know, you should just, again, ask yourself the question, like when the judge walks into this room and hears this motion, like what are they going to think is important? Like what are they going to be able to be persuaded by? Like telling me that, well, what are some examples of me doing this bad that I can think of? I had real problems with a lot of debates about education, for example. Like every now and then you'll get some debate that basically is like, I don't remember an example. There was one about like making all education based on like aptitude rather than age. So like you'd be in a like year group based on like how good you, or like how much you understood already, like the material you were ready to engage with rather than just your age. And so, you know, if you have particular beliefs about like the way that school should be structured and you start talking about like whatever the fuck you particularly think or what you think would have been better for you at school, but you forget that you're trying to convince like a normal, reasonable person about something, then it's probably gonna go badly. And like ditto, if you happen to be some like gigantic like foreign policy wonk and you start talking about like all this like intricate details of like how like X will affect Y affects Z, and then like we can outmaneuver this particular agent in like this region of the world, judge is going to be like, what the fuck is that? Like, I think that ultimately debating has sort of reached this point where basically like the most direct thing often is winning, right? Like if you have something that's affecting a large degree of people, if it's affecting them more severely, if a particular like policy would tread on some principle that has become sacrosanct, like those are very direct things that you get to hit people with in rounds. And so the more you can like take a step back and like ask yourself those basic questions and make sure they are like elements of your arguments. Like, you know, when you have this why important, like you have something like something that's obvious to a judge, then it's extremely likely you'll get some credibility. And this is something that is particularly important in rounds where basically the motion is so bizarre or like very difficult to understand well that it's hard for people to make things that are really like logically sound or like that seem very robust. So to pick an example, I believe I was in a debate once where the motion was something like, I think it was like Eastern European, like some I think it was like Eastern European countries should tear down monuments from World War II or something. It was one of these like people in like some random bit of the world should like get rid of like monuments to something, basically. And there's like many iterations of this stuff that basically all pertain to like weird historical stuff that like 95% of the people in the audience will not really understand, like to a reasonable enough degree they have anything useful to say about it. And so the reasoning, the like logical elements of the round are probably going to be terrible. Actually, yeah, there's a great example of this, like the Euros final from Warsaw, where the final is like something about like Russia changing the way that it teaches a certain bit of history in school. And you see like 4 teams that are very good, like a lot of them just talk like absolute crap. Like I think the team that wins from CG basically says things that like you'd be embarrassed if they were like in the public sphere as arguments, because they don't make a lot of sense. Like they're talking about stuff that's like oh, America's opinion on Russia is going to change if they like change this element of the way that stuff is taught in the school. And I think that like, granted, I'm not trying to like attack the debating quality of those people. Like everyone in that room was very strong. It's just that in a lot of these motions, very difficult for you to like come up with a reasonable content that's actually true in the cold light of day, because you might just not know enough things, or it's such like a difficult and abstract piece of content that it's difficult to come up with all this stuff. And that's where like actually being able to like pick some things that seem important and then just like lay down some reasons why it's sort of like 80% true, even if you can't get to like 95% true, and then really drill home why that argument is important, sort of say like it affects this thing that is like very relevant to like a large degree of people, or like tie it to something that obviously matters even if many other things in the debate don't matter. That's a very easy way in these sorts of like vague debates to actually make some progress. Okay. I guess there's some, try this out yourself. Yeah, we don't really have groups. Let's go to, yeah, okay. Let's go with this third one. So political quotas increase the quality of policy. It's like a reasonable argument you might want to make in many rounds. Why don't people try and think about sort of some of the elements that I talked about? Like what are the like underlying, what are the things that you need to demonstrate in order to make this true? What are the concerns that people are going to have, and how can you preempt them? And how can you make this argument seem important? Because I can give you a little bit of time to maybe like think about it, and people can just articulate some thoughts in the chat. I don't know if I'm still visible when I'm sharing my screen. I guess I like, your technology is capable of this. I don't really know. Okay, apparently I'm still visible. How much time do we have? Let's say 3 minutes. I don't really, I mean, most debate, you got 15 minutes prep time total. I don't think any argument people make really has more than like a couple of minutes thought at the end of the day. Close some tabs. My email's open. So yeah, let's say I'll put a timer on for, okay, those seem like some reasonable questions. I guess, okay, I guess this is, I'm showing my screen, so this should be visible. Political quotas increase representation. Who are the people currently in parliament making policies? Yeah, that's like an important bit of context. And depending on like the set of countries you're talking about, it's going to be a very different thing, right? Like the political system in Australia probably looks very different to the political system in the United States, looks very different to the political system in Hong Kong, where I live. So that's like a basic question to ask. Even they have good intentions, why they make ham-handed policies? Yeah, maybe. I mean, I guess there's like a broader question of like, what are the things that influence their decision-making? Like, what are the elements of like their background and their incentives that cause them to do either good or bad things in terms of making policy, or maybe not even have good ideas? Yeah, why is the problem specifically lived experience? Effective in getting change. Okay, yeah, I think you're asking reasonable questions. Like you basically, for the purposes of this argument, you need to, I think, have a strong sense of what are the kinds of policies that politicians currently do put forward and currently do not put forward. What are you happy in, and why? And what of those are you happy or sad about? And how do you think you can address this problem with a quota? So, you know, let's just like, without wanting to like drill too much into details, let's just like pick a particular example. You might say that at the moment, governments are very bad at giving appropriate subsidization towards, say, like housing. You know, there's lots of places in the world where there's a lot of concern that governments don't take enough steps either to make social housing available for people or take steps to diminish the problem of housing affordability, right? To just pick a particular example of policy. Then if you think about the question of, well, why would that be true? Well, one argument why that is true is that most of the people who are in parliament probably are from a wealthier background, or they're people who are susceptible to the influence of people who are from wealthier backgrounds and who probably have competing interests, right? Like, I don't think it's contentious to say the majority of politicians in most countries are pretty rich. They probably listen much more to people who are rich than people who are like poorer. And so, you know, when they're making some trade-off between making housing more affordable for people and like damaging the investments of people or allowing development that, you know, influential people don't want, maybe it's less likely. And then, you know, the natural sort of other thing you need to talk about as well, if you had quotas for maybe people from like particular socioeconomic classes in parliament, then perhaps it's more likely there would be people there who would have a much more direct understanding and appreciation of the problems that this causes, and then they can take steps to like remedy those sorts of things. And you could expand upon that to maybe things like, you know, taxation, even like policy with respect to like where the government deploys resources, like how it deploys resources, you know, in a very similar question of, say, how should the government approach policy with respect to, say, indigenous groups or something, or people of certain ethnic backgrounds, then clearly it's much more likely the person from a particular background is going to understand those problems. And, you know, in different contexts, depending on exactly what you're trying to do, it would probably help to give a lot of detail about like exactly what kinds of policies you're talking about, right? Like talking about housing policy or indigenous policy is sort of, it's like a reasonable, like it's probably what people who are giving speeches somewhere like between like, I don't know, pick a number like 76 and 81 maybe is saying, like they identify like a relevant area of policy and they elaborate a bit about why this might improve it. But if you look at really great speeches, they probably have like a very precise understanding of exactly where the pressure points are. Like it's not just housing policy writ large. It's like, you know, the particular problem of like, I don't know, like let's say like negative gearing, just to like throw something out there, right? Or they might be able to like highlight specific elements that they want changed and then very directly talk about why those things are going to be altered in this new world. And so that's like how I would think about the substantive stuff. Like I would ask those questions that we sort of discussed, like what are the things we're trying to change? What are the current problems with incentives and the people? What changes when you have a quota and so on? And how do I think it's going to fix it? And then there's the question of like, well, why is this important? In some debates, it's not necessarily that difficult to explain why it's important, and it's not very contentious. Like in this debate, the goal of having better policy, insofar as that is like a thing that people agree on, isn't going to be contentious. It might be a little bit debated what good policy constitutes. So you might need to do a little bit of work to explain that, you know, the kinds of policies we're likely to change are particularly important, especially if you're making some trade-off against other things, like other facets of the government that might be damaged a little bit in the process of doing these kinds of things. But broadly, I hope that makes some sense as like a process to follow when you're trying to do this sort of stuff, right? Like I began by asking myself some basic questions about like, what am I trying to achieve? What is a reasonable person going to like be persuaded of is sort of the state of the world and the current problems that we face? And then what are the elements of this policy that are likely to actually address those problems? And then subsequently, you know, like, why is this a relevant argument to the extent that that's likely to be contentious? Right, common mistakes. Okay. Yeah, I think these are all probably worth talking about. So arguing against common intuitions, right? So I'll talk a little bit about this. I I sort of thought for a while that there's some notion of credibility in debating, right? Like whenever you're in a room, let's say it's like world round one, you've never met any of the other speakers in the room, you've never met any of the judges in the room, they probably don't know you or whatever. Like you walk in and you have a finite amount of credibility, you know? Like the judge is expecting anything from like someone who's potentially like a competitor win the tournament right down through to like the very worst 55 you have ever seen. You know, like there's a pretty wide range, like round one of worlds, as to what the judge could be presented with. And so when you start saying things, like it's much easier to burn through credibility than it is to get it back. Like if you begin by saying something that is like batshit insane or something that is like very unobvious or very weird, like the judge is going to very rapidly think that you're just an idiot. And, you know, that might be unfair. Like it might be possible to give like a very good speech that has like 90% great content and 10% like really weird stuff. But, you know, I think that as an activity, you should definitely make things as like downhill as possible for yourself. Like you should just think about what is going to be really easy to convince a judge is super important and how can I lock those things down, especially from opening. Then sort of ironically, given that I'm saying that, the second thing is also very relevant, like focusing too much on the things that are easy to explain rather than things that are necessary to explain. I think that very often when I lost a round, I would like know that it was going to go badly beforehand because there was like often like a very core element of some argument that I was struggling to come up with a good sort of explanation for, or there was some argument that was really concerning because I could not think of a reasonable way of getting around it. And so back when I was like very bad at debating, often I just like either wouldn't recognize those things or I just like try and like, you know, bulldoze my way through, just like whatever, we'll just like deal with it, say other stuff. But inevitably, like if something is a really obvious problem with there's a really obvious problem with an argument, or there's a really good argument for the other side, like ultimately you're probably going to encounter it in the round. Like it's very rare that, especially in a BP debate, like both teams on the opposition will miss a very easy and very persuasive thing, or, you know, sort of like as a natural corollary that they will miss a very obvious flaw with an argument that you make or some deficit in it. Like, you know, like if your argument is super robust logically in terms of like why X leads to Y leads to Z, but it only affects like 2 people, like you're probably not going to get away with no team calling it out. And even if they don't call it out, a judge probably is going to be sitting there wondering why on earth they care about these sorts of things. So if you're concerned with something in the round, I think that you should it's almost worth like making the other elements of your speech a bit worse to make sure you lock down the thing that is most contentious or the most likely to burn you. Because again, like you have this finite amount of credibility, and if you leave sort of like gaping holes for someone to exploit, you know, it's probably going to end up costing you a lot more than the marginal benefit of like a slightly better explanation of like your third argument is going to give. Explain why something might happen rather than it will happen. These are not my slides. I don't really agree with that as being a mistake. Like sometimes it can be true that you can only reasonably prove something is 90% or like even 50% likely to happen. I think in those cases, it's probably more important to explain why the consequence is very impactful, even if it's not certain. So, you know, like, let's say like we're deciding whether we should flip a coin, and like if it's heads, then like we'll give $100,000 to some poor person, and if it's tails, we'll like kill 15 people. Probably most people would not want to flip the coin, right? So, you know, even though it's not a certain thing, it's still like a pertinent consequence to think about. And that doesn't even need to be 50-50, right? It could probably be like 99-1. And most people's intuitions would say that you probably still shouldn't like flip the biased coin. Okay, 4, I do agree with. Too many mechanisms and explaining all of them poorly. So ironically, I think most people have the opposite problem where they don't have enough mechanisms. They have one thing and they still explain it poorly. But it is true that it's often better in a round to have like a small number of things that are explained well rather than a large number of things that are explained badly. And I think it's worth taking a moment to state that in a lot of speeches that you might see online or from very good people, sometimes people do have like gigantic laundry lists of arguments. Like I'm very guilty of having done this in the past, for example. And I think there's an important difference, which is that like, if you go and watch like better speeches, the laundry lists are not all like distinct things. They all tend to be like different reasons why something is going to be true, like very self-contained and very like logically clear different things. Like, you know, if you're trying to explain why like a political actor wants to do a certain thing and you have 6 different reasons like that are all just different things that they clearly care about that are going to be made, they're going to be helped by enacting some policy. You have a lot of things, but each of them like individually is very self-contained. They don't require a lot of work because it's mostly just like an exposition about why some obvious thing is true. So if the way you want to build up an argument is have like 6 or 7 very clear things that are unlikely to be that contentious, but nonetheless give a lot of useful detail and make it unlikely that an opposing team can tear them all down and make something untrue, that's a reasonable way of trying to prove something. But if you're trying to make like 6 different, like to some degree contentious and like non-obvious claims in a single argument, that's probably just too hard to do because you're very bounded by the constraints of the time that you have available. And so, you know, you should think about everything that I say is displacing other stuff that I could be saying in more detail that I could be giving an argument. So it's often useful, like even when you finish writing an argument, to think like, is this actually helping me that much, or should I cross it out to make sure I explain other stuff better? The last thing, not being specific enough, yeah, that's sort of the example I was giving about parents raising their children in prison, for example. You know, like if you just talk about like one facet of the argument, but you don't actually drill down into like the context of what's going on, then I think it's very unlikely that you're going to get a lot of credibility. And this is especially true in debates where it's like very unobvious what country like it's going to apply to. Like, what's an example? I guess, yeah, I think I saw some motion recently that was like requiring all infrastructure projects to be approved by like a referendum. And the idea was basically, you know, like if you want to build a big dam somewhere, you've got to have like a majority of the people in that area agree to it rather than simply just building it. Now, I think that that kind of motion is obviously going to play out very differently in different countries, right? Like the way that a referendum would be conducted, the likely changes to the kind of policies that were implemented are vastly different in like, I don't know, like depending on like the government structure and like how susceptible it is to corruption, like how democratic the country is and so on. So if you just talk in the abstract about why a referendum is good, you have this like huge gaping problem where any team can stand up and say like, all that stuff is all well and good in theory, but let's think about like XYZ countries where it's actually going to apply. So very often in arguments, when you ask yourself the question, like, what is a reasonable judge going to be wondering when they see this motion or when I try and make this argument? If they're going to be asking themselves their question, well, what's an actual example of how this would work? And does the argument make sense there? And there is some problem with the examples you can think of. I think it's a very good like piece of evidence that you need to rethink that argument or that you need to give a bit more detail. So the process of coming up with arguments are, what are the most important and obvious arguments to what do I need to prove and lock them down? Yeah, that's like essentially what I do. I mean, I've heard over the years, like all sorts of weird stuff, like people have different systems, but ultimately like, you know, at the end of the day, debating is such like a time constrained activity. And, you know, as much as people like to think they're experts and stuff when they do a lot of debating, most people really are not experts in most of the topics that they talk about. Oh, you should just feel free to talk rather than raising your hand. But yeah, like I think basically whenever I'm like in prep time, I simply just like, I look at a motion, I think, well, what's the obvious stuff here? Like, what is a reasonable person going to be wondering or would believe is true? And how, and what are the like elements of that are going to be contentious and how my opponent going to attack me? And what do I need to prove to make it true? I guess, Artem, if you had a question.
Yeah, I have a question according the second point, to concentrate on things which are necessary to explain. For instance, it is a great point, but do you have some tips how to cope with that intention to focus on the easiest things, especially in terms of time limitations and the lack of ideas and so on?
Yeah, maybe this would be easiest if I like go and look up some motions, so we can go through some concrete examples. There's some website that has lots of motions on it. I've not looked it up in several years, so I don't remember. Maybe I'll just look up debate motions on my phone. Hello Motions. Ah, yes. Let me just pick a random motion, and then I will tell you my first thoughts on it. I'm going to be a little bit selective. All right. I'm going to be biased and pick a motion from the Cambridge IB. So this motion I looked up was this. This house would give companies tax breaks on all revenues paid as remuneration. I guess they define what that is. Salaries and bonuses. Bonus to all female employees. Okay. So, let's assume you're just like OG. You're like 15 minutes. You're think about like, why should we do this thing? Someone just like shout out, like, what are the things that are like really obviously important this round? Like, what's the first stuff that a person's going to think when they see this motion? And you can just like say stuff out loud. I don't want people to think too carefully about this. Like, this is meant to be like, what goes through your head when you're like the 30-second to minute-long walk to wherever your room is? Well, I guess I can tell you what I would think. Like, I would just think that this is a debate about basically trying to incentivize businesses to like hire women and pay them more, right? Like the obvious effect of this policy is that it's like now much better for you to like hire a woman compared to a man, right? Because you just get a tax break on whatever you pay them. Okay? So, you know, most of this debate is going to turn on like, is this a good way of doing this compared to like a good way of like basically like helping women in the workforce compared to some of the alternatives that it might compete out, and like what are the consequences of it, right? So I think if I was in, I mean, this seems like a little bit of a slam dunk from OG, because you just stand up and say like, oh, now like companies will have incentives to like take people back on when they go into childcare, like keep them like when they have a child, you know, when they might otherwise fall out of the workforce, because there's like a huge financial benefit to keeping them on. It encourages them, or like it's less of a disincentive on the margin to increase their salaries when they ask for it, because, you know, it sort of costs them less per dollar because they just get it back as a tax break, or some fraction of it back as a tax break. You know, when they ask for pay rises, it will go up. Like, there's lots of, I think, you know, the OG speech I'd probably give would like, I think very necessarily try and contextualize the problem, like why are women paid less? Would they go into maybe less highly paid careers? Like, why do they fall out of the workforce? Try and explain some of the details about that. Why does this very directly give a reason for companies to alleviate some of those problems? Like, why does it encourage them to pay these people more, fight to keep them in the workforce, like fight to selectively hire them and so on? And then that's a lot of good stuff that you get to claim. Then maybe you need, I would be a little worried, like almost the offense that you have is almost too good in this round from OG. Like, it's, I think most of the things that I said are going to be extremely difficult for an opposition team to take down ultimately, just because I think it's really obvious, right? Like, a judge is going to require a lot of logical effort to be persuaded that, you know, like, well, now if I hire a dude, I just have to pay them 100 grand. If I hire a woman, I pay them 100 grand, but the government gives me like 30 grand back. It's really obvious, I think, that that's going to change their behavior in the direction of hiring more women, right? And like fighting to keep them in the workforce compared to what you could otherwise do. So the biggest problem that strikes out to me when I see this motion is sort of the defensive elements. Like, what is the opposition going to say they're going to do instead? Because probably they're going to come up with some like alternative mechanism of like trying to fix these problems, or they're going to highlight maybe that this is like, it has some, you know, it's expensive, it upsets people, blah, 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 like any number of like stupid things. So I guess, you know, when I see this motion, I try to think about arguments. I would just, you know, I guess that's sort of like implicitly showing that I sort of naturally think about like, how good is the stuff that I have on my side? And in this case, I think it's like pretty good. In other debates, I might think it's pretty bad. Yeah, like here's an example below where I think the argument is going to be pretty hard. This house believes the state should provide no further services beyond those of basic law and okay. Yeah, I mean, so in this round, you almost have the inverse problem, right? Like it is super easy, I think, for most people on opposition, opening opposition to be like, right, you know, like they can even just like, we agree with you like 80% of the way, but it's pretty good that schools exist, or like, it's pretty good that like, if you have a heart attack, that someone pulls you out of the gutter and takes you to like a hospital, you know? Like there are obviously some very pieces of low-hanging fruit for the opposition team to use to sort of like hit you with. And so the biggest problem in this round for this motion is like trying to think offensively of reasons why you might want to do this. There's obviously some principled reasons why this is like a sort of like, you know, it has some reasons to commend it. And there's lots of mitigation that you can do. But here, you know, I would be thinking very hard to try and work out, you know, I guess in terms of like offensive stuff, I'd almost try and explain why like the state is like really bad at providing services, right? Like I'd probably have to, it's not enough to say that, oh, it would be good if we didn't have to pay as much tax, for instance. I'd probably proactively trying to think of cases of the government like fucking up the provision of basic services. And I'd want to try and paint like as bleak a picture as possible of the way it deploys those services in comparison to one that like maybe was just done by private companies or like by some agreement of people outside the arms of the state, you know? Like things that come to mind as examples would be talking about police forces that just like are like atrocious and do terrible things to people. Maybe talking about examples where government is just like really terrible at spending people's money. Like it just throws money at, you know, particular pet issues of politicians and so on. So there's lots of ways where you can proactively try and point about the government being bad. And then you just need to like combine that with some like, as best as you can muster, a defense of what the alternative world is going to look like. And then, you know, as long as you do those things reasonably, I mean, I think the first motion, probably OG did very well. In the second motion, probably OO did very well. But, you know, even within the bounds of those things, you can, you know, still do better or worse. Maybe the private sector. Oh, I missed someone typing a while ago. Maybe the private sector will expand to cover up this. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's sort of the hope I think that you have, that the private sector will expand and there's some other alternative mechanism. I think that's the kind of thing you're naturally trying to defend. Just a question of like how good you can make that sound. And so again, like it's an example of something where like a lot of detail is going to help you, right? Like maybe, you know, maybe like a weaker speech should just be like, private companies can do this, full stop. And that's like where it ends. And then like the opposition team is just like, what the fuck do you mean? Like it's really complicated and expensive to run a hospital, and like go and look at the US, it's terrible, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, a more sophisticated government argument might be saying stuff like, well, you know, in a market that, you know, I don't think, does this motion preclude governments from regulating? Yeah, sort of. I mean, I guess you could, I would even go so far as to try and make arguments about like, you could try, I think like for healthcare, for example, like an obvious complaint people are going to say is like the American healthcare system is terrible because, you know, it has a lot of problems that are very well documented in the media around the world. And so I think that, you know, trying to begin by explaining why some of those problems maybe are the consequence of the government being involved to some degree, and maybe those problems wouldn't be as relevant in other places, is something that I'd very naturally want to go to. And I think the strongest government teams would like probably not just have a picture about why the private sector could do stuff, but they'd be a little bit savvy and maybe preempt some of the obvious things like that the opposition teams are going to go towards as ways of demonstrating that it doesn't work. I'm not even going to look at that motion. Think about quantitative easing. All right, let's keep going through some slides for a second. So after creating the argument, blah, 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 don't care. Paradigm analysis. Yeah, okay, I'll talk very briefly about this. I mean, I don't think it's as advanced as the way this is set out seems to make it describe. Like, often, I've portrayed arguments, I think, to a large degree as being very, like, black and white. Like, you know, you sort of make things, you try and prove things are true and prove some things are untrue, right? Now, I think that's like a reasonable way to approach stuff for the purposes of debating early on, for the simple reason that early on, I think people are just terrible at doing these things well, right? Like most of the time until you're consistently giving speeches above 80s, then I think that you often just have like pretty, you know, simple problems with the way that you go about explaining various things. Like you'll forget something, you won't give a necessary bit of context, you'll leave some like gaping hole, you won't explain why the argument matters or something. And so until you can get to the point where you're not making those basic mistakes, I think that you can think of arguments as very black and white, because usually arguments either will be true because like you proved them and no one really rebutted it well, or they won't be true because like you made some obvious mistake. But, you know, at maybe like a higher level, eventually it starts to be true that like both sides will say persuasive things. And in particular, like both sides will have compelling reasons why like something might be true or not true in a particular situation. And that's where like I think what this slide is getting at, you know, you sort of relax the requirement that you're trying to prove something is definitively true or false, and you simply ask the question of, does it make something more likely or not? And you sort of accept there's some degree of uncertainty, but maybe you highlight that the uncertainty that the opposition has raised only pertains to some small fraction of the people that are involved. Maybe there are some examples where it's not that relevant, or, you know, just in general that your stuff is slightly better than theirs. And, you know, I think this what can help you do most frequently is save time, I think. So often if there's a bit of rebuttal that you don't really want to have to address, or it doesn't make sense for you to spend a lot of time because maybe like the underlying argument was made pretty well and pulling it down bit by bit is going to take up too much of your speech, you can just say stuff like, well, on the balance of probabilities, like, even if this is only 50% true, then we're still fine. Or here's like a couple of reasons why our argument is more likely to be relevant than the thing the opposition said. Okay, let me quickly go. I hear some beeping on Discord, so let me go and check that for a second. Why do I hear beeping? I guess it was not something that's relevant to me. So let me go back to sharing my screen. Oh God, where was the button for that? Present now. My entire screen. Okay. Okay. Let me just. Yeah, I think for the rest of this, let's just go through some examples. There's a classic schoolie's motion insofar as you want a teacher to complain at you. This house would legalize the buying and selling of. Okay, another, you know, very, very standard debate. So I guess why doesn't everyone, again, imagine that they are OG, try and think about some argument that you might want to make, and then go through like the basic questions that we've talked about and try and explain and try and make sure you hit all the things that we've discussed so far. And I'll give you maybe 5 minutes to do that. Then we can chat about it. All right. So who's got something, an argument, and some reasonable stuff to talk about?
I think the first one can be similar to drug users case, for instance, we are kind of making that market legal, so we are making more clear conditions for its participants, because the existence of such market is quite natural. It will exist no matter how government treats it, whether government legalizes that or not. But in case it legalizes, it provides more clear and safe working conditions for people who are engaged, as well as opportunity for government to taxate that market.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess like it's one of those arguments that's like at danger of like ballooning into something gigantic. But yeah, it's like I think the core bits of what you're saying is that like it's going to exist anyway, and it will be safer and have some like better properties if it's legal and regulated, as opposed to the case where it is like illegal and not regulated. You don't have any different arguments? Okay, principally illegitimate. Yeah, I think that's the second argument. Like, there's some element which is just like, if a consenting adult wants to like work as a like prostitute or in some other sexual service, then, you know, whose business is it for the government to stop them doing that? And those are arguments that I think actually like they have very different, you have to approach them in very different ways, I think, if you want to explain them well. So let's talk about them one at a time. So on the first of them, let's just try and answer all the questions that could be potentially contentious, right? So for the first thing, there's this underlying claim that like sex work will exist regardless of what you do. Like that's potentially contentious. It's probably not true that like the amount of like, the amount that people go to prostitutes is probably higher in, say, the Netherlands than it is in like, well, certainly than it is true in like a place where it's just like outright illegal and there are like very severe punishments, right? Like it's definitely a bigger sector in certain places depending on the legality. But, you know, you still, I think there are very basic statements you can make that are probably decently plausible to a judge that it's likely to exist in any case, right? Both because there are always going to be some people who want to make use of those services. It's like one of those things that's difficult to explain logically, but I guess it seems to empirically have been true for most of human history. And there's also, I think, another very natural thing, probably more relevant thing you can say, is like there's always going to be people who are quite happy to run such like businesses even where they are illegal to make money to the extent that it's a thing, right? Like criminal organizations, like people who are involved in human trafficking or whatever, there's like a big quantity of people willing to sort of try and make that money if it's not being done in a legal and transparent way. So to the extent that it's contentious, I think it's mostly contentious on a level of the degree to which it is going to exist in society rather than existing at all. But it's probably not that important a thing to talk about. So the next thing is, well, what are the bad elements of it when it is illegal compared to when it is legalized? And, you know, what are the differences? Well, I think the first thing is a question of safety for, you know, both the people who are both of the sex workers and the people who are like making use of this service. So from the point of view of the sex worker, if it's illegal, then they probably are very averse to like going to the police if something bad happens or if someone is dangerous or threatening. It's probably much more likely the person who is running the organization is like a criminal themselves. So I think it's probably more likely that there's, you know, human trafficking involved with people in more like coerced circumstances, just because people can't naturally self-select into doing it legally. So probably the people who do end up in it are going to be on average in there from worse circumstances. Probably the like standard of like medical care that you can access if it is illegal is worse. You know, like you probably don't have like as well constructed a like, you know, in countries where it's legal, probably the like businesses that run these things have a very good system for like making sure that the like interactions that take place are safe, that people are checked for sexually transmitted diseases regularly, that people get like the appropriate healthcare and have all the appropriate stuff that you need. and that's more likely if it's like a legal business than if it's just someone running something that's a bit shady. So, you know, from a like health perspective, it's probably more likely to be good for people when it's a legal business. It's probably more likely to be safe for the people who are sex workers when it's legal, both because they can access recourse when illegal stuff happens, and the people who are going to be involved in the business are probably less dangerous as a whole. So yeah, and then I mean, I guess I don't want to spend too much time going into it in detail, but I think those are like the relevant things that you probably want to talk about in that kind of situation, right? Like you want to just make sure that it's clear and you have at least some reasons why the comparative on both sides is that it will exist. And then I think there are some very obvious claims that you can make about why it's going to be safer and better for people on the other side. Oh, sorry. And another thing that's very natural to claim, I think, is that probably you can like, the people who are the like sex workers are going to like command a higher wage, I would say, if it's legal. And I say this purely for the reason that like, if you are like an employee of like an illegally run business, probably like you're not afforded the same, well, for a start, not afforded the same labor protections, but I think you're probably in like a substantially worse bargaining position than if it's like a legal business, right? Like if you're working in like an illegal brothel in a place where you can't, you know, if you tell the police what you were doing, then you will go to jail as well, then probably it's like hard for you to change jobs, and it's probably hard for you to get like recourse if like your employer just starts withholding money from you, for example. So, you know, from the perspective of the sex worker, it's probably like much better for you to be doing it somewhere where it's legal. For your health, it's probably a much better thing. For your safety, it's probably a much better thing. And so the real contentious thing in the argument probably is going to be the extent to which it takes it. Yeah, if you had a question, sorry, someone raised their hand. I'm not sure if it was accidental. But yeah, is there a question?
Yeah, actually, I have a question. Or
yep,
I think it's a place for discussion whether sex workers' wages will arise, because I think when the market will be legalized, it should be more suppliers of that good, and that service will become easier to get for the consumer. So
yeah, I mean, so I agree that supply increases. It's not obvious to me that demand doesn't increase as well, and like the balance of like how much supply and demand. Like, okay, what would be an example? I don't know an EU country where like a Western EU country where prostitution is illegal, but like the hypothetical I was thinking of is like, do you think a prostitute in Amsterdam is paid more or less than a prostitute would be in, say, like London, if like being a prostitute in London was illegal? Well, the things that seem relevant for that, to try to answer that question in my head, are like, well, probably there are like more people making use of that service in Amsterdam, right? So there's like naturally more demand for the service, but like by the same token, there's probably more supply. So it's not clear how that balances out. I think the thing that seems more direct to me is just the like earlier statement I made, which is that like you like the difference between being like an employee of like an illegally run business and being an employee of like a legally run business, probably like a huge increase in your pay, right? Because just you have recourse and options in a way that you probably didn't in an alternative world. But yeah, I agree that's maybe one of the more contentious things that I'm claiming, but I think it's, you know, you can always think about whether an argument is like more hassle than it's worth for an opposing team to take down. And it's great. Like if you can think of arguments that like are really finicky to like rebut or difficult to undo, but like pretty easy to make, like those are things that you should really enjoy getting to say and around. But what I was saying is that almost the more contentious thing, it would seem, is like the extent to which the amount that the service was accessed is going to increase or diminish, right? Because one way you could try and defeat this argument from the opposition would be to say that, like, you know, if hypothetically the two worlds we're comparing is one in which like 10 people work as sex workers and their lives are dreadful, and a world where like 1,000 people work as sex workers and their lives are like, you know, 6 out of 10 bad rather than 10 out of 10 bad, but it's still not great, then, you know, that could be a trade-off that you wouldn't actually prefer to make. And so there's like this much more subtle question of, well, what do the two worlds actually look like? And that's where maybe elaborating a bit about the people who are likely to make use of, you know, sexual services in either world is probably useful. But my inclination is that it's much easier for you to like sort of get points on the board by just saying like, oh, it's safer and better and da-da-da. Like, it's easy for you to do that very quickly and very persuasively. It's much harder for somebody to like unwrap that all and make the kind of counter argument that I'm proposing. So I think it's probably a very safe thing to say. To talk about the second argument that was raised, which was this thing about like the principle, the reason this was sort of different is that the elements of what you're trying to persuade someone of like just, they're very orthogonal, right? Like in the first case, you're trying to demonstrate something that is like a very concrete substantive claim about the world, right? Like you have to think about what does the workplace look like, what changes, and then try and elaborate on why that environment gets better or worse. In this case, you're trying to make a statement about like, basically just like the government shouldn't do certain things, like even if it is like good or bad, like there's some things where it's not okay to do. And I think you like hit on some reasonable, you know, yeah, like it's difficult to disentangle this as a kind of work from other things that people do in like a legalized and regulated situation. It's not clear that people are not consenting. So there are obviously some counter arguments that you could face, like even to just because something is legal and theoretically people are consenting, that is not necessarily the same as people actually giving like consent. Like what would be an example? I mean, if people are bad at, I mean, it's typical things that can typically override people's intuitions that like freely giving consent is something we should respect, and things like maybe it's difficult to ascertain the consequences that you're going to take. You know, like an opposition team could say like, it's difficult for someone to understand the consequences that working as a sex worker is going to have in their life. It doesn't seem obviously true in this case to me, but it's something that could be a concern. You know, like, let's say like, if I say I consent to take drugs, but I don't really understand the consequences of it, like it's pretty reasonable for someone to say like, well, we shouldn't let you do it, even though you think you want to do it because there's some uncertainty or like a misunderstanding on your part. By the same token, the government impedes lots of things that people could consent to, but have just like broader societal harms, right? So what is an example of something the government stops that you can consent to? Well, I guess drugs would be an example, right? Like in theory, you know, you could make exactly the same arguments about like buying heroin from your friendly neighborhood drug dealer, right? And using those drugs, you know, you could say like, oh, well, both people have consented. I guess your second thing you said, there's an exchange of money. Yeah, maybe even the drug dealer has like a customer services department. You could complain to his boss if the heroin you get is not sufficiently high quality or something. But, you know, still, there's lots of exogenous harms to both like the supply chain of drugs and also like if consumption of drugs is a more widespread scene. I have no experience, to be clear. I think the only drug I have ever consumed is like alcohol and, well, I was going to say pain medication, but I suppose chemotherapy drugs count. Okay, but no, I am not. I'm very tame in that regard. What was I saying? Yeah, I think that the government gets involved and stops lots of things that people can freely consent to. So you need to think about, well, are there like external harms that are going to take place that are sufficiently important that maybe you can make some like overarching principle claim? You know, like it's perfectly reasonable in debating to say things like, yep, we're screwing like X group of people over, but like it's more important for like Y bigger group of people. And there's lots of kinds of things you can talk about, like probably prostitution, like to the extent that it's legalized. I think I'm not an expert in this stuff with regard, like I've never read like papers or thought very carefully about like how the economics of it work, but I could very easily see it being true that in legalizing and increasing the amount of people who end up working as it, you do a lot more harm than good. There are probably also some cultural changes. There might be a lot of like subsidiary consequences to the areas where prostitution is like a primary industry. You know, there's lots of, you know, second order effects, I think, depending on which kinds of business you legalize and don't legalize. And so subsequently, I think the government has a very natural stake in trying to at least think about whether certain kinds of employment, even if they're consensual, shouldn't be allowed. That's not to say that in this case it overwrites those things, but I think that it's probably insufficient to just simply state the things that you've said, where you're like, well, it has some properties that are similar to other things that we legalize. You probably need to talk a little bit about some of the potential competing principle claims and why you think they are not relevant in this case. And I think I want to highlight that a little bit, because often people think principled arguments are just about saying they don't have concrete things that are true or false. They're just like about, you stand up and you give some great oratory about why like we should respect autonomy or something like this or that or whatever. You know, really, they're almost identical conceptually to like substantive arguments. They're just like, the way that you approach it is that you begin by thinking about things that you like are asserting as core values or things that should be very defensible. And then you try and, you know, sometimes you have to use like intuition pumps or whatever, but you still need to be very detailed. You need to think about what are the things that I'm trading off against each other? How do they apply in this situation? And to what extent can I make the world that we're living in, or the world this debate exists in, seem much more naturally like it should fall on our side of the principle rather than the opposing side? Okay. So let me find another motion. Okay. What do people think? Ian? Yes.
So does the undermining gender means that if her child is a son, she would like try to convince him that he's a girl, or she would like convince about both genders to be both like girl and boy to be like non-binary?
Yeah, I think this very often in debate you encounter things where like your honest opinion of the motion is like, what a stupid fucking idea, basically. And I mean, depending on how you interpret this motion, I think that the scale of places that your like opinion of this or my opinion of this motion would lead would like somewhere from just like, that's weird but all right, to like, what a like fucking ridiculous idea. So yeah, the first question you have to ask is like, what are you actually doing? And then the second question is like, well, what are some reasonable arguments and how can I make them sound both true and persuasive? So the first thing you said, like, I think trying to convince your like cisgendered son that they are trans is probably an atrocious thing to try and do. Like, it will definitely lose and also doesn't make a lot of sense. I guess the debate is much more about maybe like, I don't know, like
maybe making cis people, cis children to be like
I think I would definitely stray well away from any notion of like trying to convince your child that they are like different from whatever gender they end up actually identifying as. I think that it probably is more about like maybe like encouraging them to play, like playing with dolls or like doing things that like fall outside like the typical gender roles. So, and I think this is like an important skill set, right? What would I talk about if I was presented with this motion? I would not talk at all about all the crazy shit that people might think this debate is about. I would talk a lot about like having a daughter and convincing them and like very proactively making them do things that like usually only boys get to do, right? So I would probably like, you know, encourage them to go and like, you know, like buy like toys that are marketed as like boys' toys, like make them go and do like sports and like activities that typically only boys do at a young age or whatever. Now, it's obviously a little bit difficult to say what the spirit of this motion was. It's a lot easier if you're like actually at the tournament and you can ask people. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is like, if you have to make a decision, right? You have to make a decision that you're gonna go with something that's like pretty difficult to persuade people of, and then you should only really make that decision if you have some like very good battering ram to use as the debate, right? Like you can sort of, you're going to try and claim something that like probably is not true or very difficult to persuade people of, but you're going to like go on the extreme end of the spectrum and at least you have something to talk about. Or you need to think of a way that you can actually get the motion to something that I think a reasonable person might be persuaded of. I think the articulation I gave is something you could reasonably persuade some people of. And then it becomes a very simple debate, right? Like you, you know, it's quite within your right, the opposition's right to say like, well, you actually have to give us something to debate against. And sure, like maybe you end up saying you're willing to do things that are like pretty extreme, right? You know, like you just like prevent them from doing stuff that would like make them fall within like the typical gender roles of society. but I think you should stop well short of anything that would like, you know, verge into crazy land. But yeah, then again, all the natural stuff applies, right? You should think about, well, how can I convince someone that this stuff is good? Well, I need to tie it to, rather than trying to talk about like, I want to make them into X, you should talk about like, there are lots of forces in society pushing them away from various things, right? And so the only way to give them like a balanced upbringing or facilitate them making decisions in a more independent way would, you know, yeah, exactly. Yeah, like exactly as you're saying in this comment, right? You know, like, you should talk in reference to like a society that is like pushing them in certain directions, right? I think it's much easier to say you're going to force someone to do something or like fight back against something if you can articulate why the status quo is like very geared in the opposite direction. So, you know, I would begin a PM speech by talking very clearly about the pressures that are faced by like a young girl who is growing up and why those things are damaging to them. And then I would try and articulate some like very concrete and sort of extreme to some degree steps you could take to try and push them away from those sorts of things. And then I would defend that like as robustly as I could, because I have like a clear reason to do it. I have some clear benefits that I can articulate from it, and it seems reasonably important. And I've like strayed away from what I think might happen in this round, which is that people pick something that's like a bit crazy to try and defend, and then it's like logically inconsistent and difficult to like actually make seem very true. Pick another motion. Okay, and then we've got a second one. All right. Let me just go through my thoughts on the first one. Like, there's a ton of argument about Euroscepticism, bad management, domination by large EU states, etc., and national ownership or even nationalization at the state level is better. Okay. Yeah. Right. So there are some problems with, so let's talk about the first motion. This is like the EU should create like Uramco or something and have like one gigantic state-owned oil manufacturer. Now, obviously, one like sort of barrier to making good like analytical arguments is going to be that like probably no one in the room actually like knows the distribution of like oil and gas resources in Europe and like how they're all structured off the top of their head, right? Which is like a sad true thing about debating, that we talk about things we don't really know that much about. The main thing that seemed obvious to me as an argument that Prop can make is sort of the inverse of what you're saying, which is that like at the moment, a lot of EU policy is like undercut by the fact that countries need to like import oil, right? And they like have to make decisions about their like energy state of the world. Like, obviously, for example, very famously, I think like Germany importing a lot of oil and that having impacts on the way that it affects its foreign policy, that's like a pretty big concern for the EU, right? When sort of like the defining country in the organization has a lot of bad incentives based on the fact that, you know, it needs to get oil from somewhere. So in terms of like the things that stand out to me as arguments that you could make, well, so probably there's some arguments about it makes environmental policy better, it makes foreign policy better, because like the EU as an organization can really be like hamstrung a little bit to the extent that individual countries like don't want to do various things, want to drag their feet, right? So I think this is like a natural way of kind of like centralizing people's incentives so that the EU can act as like a single unified bloc rather than individual countries that are all pulling in different directions. Now, I can understand why as Prop, it's very easy to do this debate badly, for the reason that I think you need to talk in a pretty granular level about like, what are the different, like, what are the kinds of policy that would be changed, or what are like individuals, countries' incentives, and how do those change on different sides? Now, I think almost the easiest way to think about this then is sort of like, again, just like ask these kind of questions, right? Like, what are the things that I would like the EU or that I would like about EU like policy or the way the EU behaves to change, right? You might like it to change its behavior with respect to like environmental policy. You might want it to change its behavior with respect to foreign policy, and then think, well, how is this policy going to change each of those things? Or if you can't think of proactive reasons why this is going to make stuff better, you can at least think of examples where maybe there are concrete demonstrations where like individual EU countries are doing bad things, like they're selling oil to bad parties, they're like engaging in things that are like economically bad for the EU as a whole, or they're like impeding the capacity of the EU to do things, then maybe it would be made better if you take this out of their hands. Now, granted, lots of motions about like the EU doing some very big thing are, you know, I think they're a little bitter in the mouth still for people, given that it's more likely that countries are leaving the EU than the EU is like getting its act together and doing some big expansive project in the near future. But yeah, I mean, that's the way I would approach just the arguments of the debate as a whole. Like I would try and accept that I'm probably not going to be able to come up with some like overarching story about how exactly this would all work and what like every change in the world that would happen. I would just try and focus on like a couple of concrete examples of things that I know I can affect, and then I would just try and explain why those are really important. Because the things that you say, like, oh, there's going to be Euroscepticism, bad art management, like, it's very easy as government just be like, whatever, like, people are already Eurosceptic, like, it's a very, like, generic argument. It doesn't really address the specific example of, like, an oil entity for, you know, in this debate. Domination by large EU states, well, you know, you can address that by having a good notion of like the way in which large EU states already make bad decisions with respect to their oil policy. Now, granted, this relies somewhat sadly on you having a good amount of knowledge about the EU, but, you know, I don't have that knowledge these days, but when I was doing a lot of debating, I probably did because I would have been very up to date on this stuff. But yeah, that's my thoughts on that. The second motion, legally permitting soldiers to refuse to participate in military actions and missions on a basis of conscience. What was the thing that went wrong in this round, I guess? Artem, if you have any comments.
Can I add something about this topic? I used to play this topic about soldiers, and I was in a position, and I really like this game. I was second position. The argument was about it was but I wasn't very good at arguing at that time, and now I don't think very good. But the argument was that in the army would be more the atmosphere in the army become better because captains sorry for my English, captains they who rule plain soldiers. Do you understand what I mean?
Let me just check out. So you're saying that the people who make decisions are like not thinking about the interests of soldiers?
No, like I mean, maybe not high bosses, medium. They need to be responsible for their soldiers, and they need to be good bosses to that people will follow them. That was the idea, and
okay. And so this is an argument for or against the motion. You said you were second opposition, right?
No, it wasn't opposition. This is proposition. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. I think I just misheard you. I was struggling to understand how that would be an opposition argument. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I think you're just saying that if soldiers could refuse to participate in certain things, if they were ordered to do terrible stuff, then maybe like people higher up in the military would be just generally better. Like they would make better decisions, or they would give better orders. And yeah, that's like a very reasonable argument that you could want to make. I guess, sorry, Artem, you typed this out. I guess I was just curious if you had a particular problem that you would encountered when you did this?
Yeah, I think that there was a clash when we were discussing a case when that soldier has already confirmed his participation in army, and he's trying to avoid being in a conflict. So I played as a government side. I played as a government side, and opposition proclaimed that it will be a lack of efficiency. For instance, an army can't be reconstructed so fast, and so on. So
right,
there is no options to reconstruct an army from that consists of soldiers who have already confirmed their participation, because we are talking about democratic states when an army is on contract terms.
Okay. Yeah, so let's think about, I think that the way to address that clash from proposition is probably just to think about what kind of situations is this kind of option going to be used by people, right? Like if you join the army as a soldier, it's kind of weird to think that you would start deciding to just withdraw from all active service as soon as you were given this option, right? And indeed, probably like a well-constructed version of this policy wouldn't allow people to just say like, I'm not doing it. They probably would need you to give some like exposition about why this particular action is like against your conscience, right? So I think that three things that come to mind are like, one, it's probably not in the incentive of people to just like stupidly try and withdraw from certain actions, just because like if it is their job, it's weird for them to just like decide suddenly they don't want to do the job. They could always just quit before the fact, right? And if we are talking about cases where like you're sort of like a volunteer rather than a conscript. The second thing is like a well-constructed policy probably prevents the need to like completely reconstruct the army, right? Like the majority of people who worked in the military are still going to work in the military, and it's probably a rare situation that someone thinks that an order they're given is so unconscionable they don't want to do it. It's probably like a very small amount of circumstances that this would take place. And then the third thing is just like, you can just think about, is it so obviously bad? Like if the military is giving so many orders that like soldiers are going, Jesus Christ, like I will not do this, then it's not obviously a bad thing that people are doing this. I think you need to have like a much clearer notion of like, what are the ends that the military is meant to serve that is not going to be able to fulfill if this policy took place? Now, yeah, I think one of the natural corollaries of that is like, it's a very important question to think about, like what situations would somebody choose to not participate in a military action? Like all of the analysis, all of the stuff you want to talk about in this debate is going to naturally stem from some thinking about what are the kinds of situations which people might choose to refuse an order. Well, you know, obviously if a person tells you to commit a war crime, that's probably a relevant thing. But, you know, there's probably even like more granular scales, right? Like if you think an operation is like unreasonably dangerous to civilians, or like, you know, even if the military thinks it like fulfills by the standards that it wants to set, like you just think it's unconscionable or whatever. Now, you know, there's some genuine trade-offs to be made there, right? Like, you know, why should the particular moral proclivities of one person impede the military doing something that it's ascertained is like super valuable for the state as a whole, particularly when the state like might have some legitimate interest in either like protecting itself or securing some resource of people at large. But, you know, I think that's the nature of this debate, right? You should try and think about situations in which it might take place. So what are active conflict zones where soldiers might choose to not obey orders at the moment? I think I don't want to give any examples because I don't want to say anything too controversial. But, you know, I think the way you would give good analysis would probably just be to like lay out where you think different things like this is most likely to take place, and then try and explain why like the state is not losing that much of its capacity to like legitimately defend the interests of its people in permitting this, and why it would be probably secondly particularly unconscionable to force people to do that kind of stuff in those kind of situations. But okay, I guess we've got 10 minutes left, so maybe it would be good if anyone has any questions now, because we're going to wrap up in a bit. So if anyone has any like broad questions or things they'd like to talk about for the last little bit, now's probably a good chance.
Honestly, I have some questions about topic about sexual trafficking, sexual.
Okay.
All the argument are about safety, about something is good, but the point is that in real life in Germany and Netherlands we have a lot of problem and trafficking is developing, and so we need to make a new mechanism because the legalization in these two countries failed.
Yeah, I think I sort of was trying to get at that a little bit. Like, it's a very difficult question to unpack, and certainly not really addressable in the confines of a BP debate as to whether or not like legalization is actually a good thing, right? Like, if you wanted to answer that question properly, the way you would do it would be like you would go and look at these countries, like look at a lot of data about the people, you know, like what did the like estimations of the amount of people making use of these services change, you know, before and afterwards, and you know, why did various good things happen? Why did various bad things happen? So I think that like a lot of bit of analysis in particular is sort of like, if you do have that detail, like you know about like why trafficking went up in Germany or the examples that you gave, then probably thinking about like, why did that policy work or not work there? And what are like, if you could construct a better version, would you address those things? Or if you're on the opposition, like, can you try and explain why those things are kind of like insurmountable? Okay, maybe I think the question Aslan asked is maybe better to address in the last couple of minutes because it's something that I think you can just go away from and then use. So, is it possible to give a checklist we want to tick off for each argument? Okay. I'm just going to write down everything that I think of as being relevant, and then I'm going to like adjust it at the end depending on put them in the right order. So what do I think is relevant? Let's assume for the sake of argument, we're talking about a debate where there's like some concrete policy, like we are going to implement something and it's going to make some change and we understand the nature of that change rather than some of these more abstract topics. So what would I ask myself? I would ask myself is, what situations does this apply in? Like, you know, and I guess the underlying thing is like, you know, so like a very natural question is like, what is the policy going to change? Like, where is it going to apply? Are we talking about like a very narrow range of situations where it's very clear, like it only applies in like these three cases, or are there like a litany of different circumstances? I need to think about those all in a great degree of detail. Each argument, okay. So, you know, what is the consequence I want to frame? So for like each individual argument, what's the thing that I'm trying to prove is true? Then I would ask myself, what are like the positive reasons why that thing is the case? So, you know, like that can be people like have this incentive that's obvious, therefore they do this, therefore my claim is true. And, you know, for each individual one of those, they should probably relate back to the situations that it applies to and kind of the context you're giving. And they should start from very like logical and intuitive bits about like human behavior or like things that people want to do. Then I would ask myself, like, what are and then what potential issues I need to address. So not just like, why can I say there's like a positive string of logic from like things that everyone believes through to this thing I'm trying to prove. The other thing you need to think of is, what are the elements of this argument that the opposing team is going to take umbrage with? You know, what are they going to say is untrue, or what are the problems they're going to highlight? So, you know, the thing that was just raised is a good example of this. Like, you might say like, oh, legalization would like improve the situation. And they might say, well, you know, empirically it didn't do it in Germany or whatever for XYZ reason. So you should think about those things and try and mitigate them or construct your argument in a way that sort of like makes it easy to rebut those claims that are made against you later on. Is there anything else you need? I'm gonna just like, and the last thing is sort of like, why does this matter more than other things in the round? So, you know, just the sort of why important question that we talked about before. And in particular, it's just, you know, it can be something as basic as like, this affects a lot of people and other claims didn't, or it could be just like, it affects them more intensely. You know, you just need, I think it helps to always come back to some statement about why this thing that you're talking about is relevant to make the judge understand properly that the thing you're claiming is useful. But yeah, I think like if you do each of those 5 things in every round, right? And maybe I could add a little bit more detail behind like the positive reasons why this is the case, right? So like I could write something like you know, I could add some more detail there and say like, make sure that when you try and give positive reasons why something is true, you're starting from something that everyone believes, right? You know, like for the purposes of like the like having children, right? Like getting to keep your children with you when you're in jail. Like I think it's intuitive to say like parents are good for children. Like having parents around is a good thing, both for the child and for the parent, right? And then like you can step outwards from that to maybe less obvious places. But I think you, for the purpose of like retaining credibility, you should begin from obvious places that are intuitive, and then each step should like logically follow in a way that somebody's not going to be confused about. And you should be asking yourself the question like, you know, what is the judge? In the flip side, you're asking is like, what is the judge? You know, like when I judge things, very often if people make arguments, I'm sitting there wondering like, well, this is all well and good, but what about this thing, you know? Like you should ask yourself, what are the questions the judge's going to be sitting there as I'm making my substantive stuff? What are they going to be thinking is a bit dubious? And then, but then in general, like if you go through each of these 5 things and you structure them in some reasonable way, and that probably winds up being something like this kind of format, right? Like I want to talk about this. Let's talk about like, I think the first reason that's true is like this, and that's, you know, each reason will be like, here's something we all understand. Here are the consequences of that. That proves my thing. Here's a second reason, like a second intuitive starting point, get to your conclusion and so on. If you take these 5 things and then build your arguments in that kind of structured way, I'm not making any promises that you'll suddenly become amazing, but I think that it is roughly speaking impossible for like a reasonably intelligent person to like ask themselves these questions and at least make an effort to follow the structure and to give terrible speeches. You know, you might make errors in strategically how you choose to go about things, or you might like make mistakes in missing things at various points, but even just eliminating your sub 75 speeches goes a lot of the way towards improving the activity. I guess that's about 8 p.m. So I think that's time. So if anyone still has any questions, I'm happy to chat for a little bit longer. I'm not sure what your schedule looks like. So know if you will have to go back now, whether we just chat until someone comes. Yeah, okay, cool. Oh, yeah, sorry. Nice.
Thank you. It was useful.
Great. Great. See you guys. Have fun with the rest of, I actually don't even know what this thing is. I just got asked to do it by Matt. So hope you have fun with whatever training you're doing. See you guys.
Thank you so much.